Relax with stories that help you sleep, work, and calm your mind. Today's story is called Reunion After Divorce. We invite you to listen and support our channel by clicking subscribe and receiving channel notifications to conveniently follow the next videos. Sincerely, thank you. The air in the San Diego bookstore was thick with the scent of fresh ink and polished wood, a quiet hum of anticipation threading through the crowd gathered for the book launch. Soft jazz curled from hidden speakers, mingling with the clink of wine glasses and the murmur of cultured voices. Nguyen stood near the back, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to shrink his 6-foot frame into the shadows. At 36, he was a man who wore his success like a well-tailored, sweet effortless, understated but impossible to ignore. His dark hair, just long enough to graze the tops of his ears, was swept back, a single rogue strand falling over his forehead, catching the light. His eyes, a deep hazel that seemed to hold secrets he'd never share, scanned the room with a restless energy. He adjusted the cuff of his navy blazer, the crisp white shirt beneath, clinging to the lean muscles of his chest, hinting at the hours he still spent at the gym, chasing the ghosts of his past. Dylan wasn't here for the book. He'd come because a colleague had insisted, claiming the author's work was transformative. But transformative wasn't what Dylan needed. 2 years after his divorce, he'd rebuilt his life. His architecture firm was thriving. His beachfront condo was a sanctuary of clean lines and solitude. And he'd learned to sleep through the night without reaching for a body that wasn't there. He told himself he was fine. He told himself he'd moved on. But the truth lingered in the way his fingers twitched for a cigarette he hadn't smoked in years, or the way his jaw tightened when certain songs played on the radio. Then, across the crowded room, he saw her. Isla Martinez stood near the author's signing table, her laughter a soft, melodic sound that cut through the noise like a blade. At 34, she was a vision of effortless allure, her presence commanding the space without trying. Her hair, a cascade of dark auburn waves, tumbled past her shoulders, catching the golden glow of the overhead lights. It framed a face that was both sharp and soft-thighed cheekbones, a slightly upturned nose, and lips that curved like they were made for secrets. Her emerald green dress hugged her figure, the fabric clinging to the gentle swell of her hips, the dip of her waist, and the elegant curve of her collarbone, exposed by the dress's plunging neckline. The dress stopped just above her knees, revealing legs that were long and toned, the kind that made you imagine them wrapped around you in a moment of reckless abandon. Her skin, a warm olive, glowed under the lights, and when she moved, it was with a dancer's grace, each step deliberate, each gesture laced with quiet confidence. Dylan's breath caught, his heart slamming against his ribs. It had been 2 years since he'd last seen her, 2 years, since the divorce papers were signed, since the fights that tore them apart, since the nights when they'd loved each other so fiercely, it felt like they could burn the world down. Isla, his ex-wife, the woman who'd once been his everything, was here, in his city, in his space, and she was looking at him. Their eyes met across the room, a collision of hazel and deep brown, and for a moment, the world fell away. The crowd, the music, the clinking glacésit, all dissolved, leaving only the weight of that shared gaze. Her eyes, framed by lashes so long they seemed to brush her cheeks, held a storm of emotions, surprise, recognition, and something darker, something that made Dylan's pulse race. He saw the faintest hitch in her breath, the way her lips parted just enough to reveal the edge of her teeth. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass, her knuckles whitening, and he knew she felt it tooth pull, the ache, the unbearable gravity of their history. He wanted to look away, he should have, but his eyes traced her, greedy for every detail. The way her dress shifted against her skin, hinting at the curve of her breasts, the taut line of her stomach. The way her necklacia, thin gold chain with a tiny pendant rested in the hollow of her throat, drawing his gaze to the pulse he knew was racing beneath her skin. She was more beautiful than he remembered, or maybe it was the distance that made her seem untouchable, like a painting you could only admire from afar. But Dylan knew her body better than any canvas. He knew the freckle just below her left ear, the scar on her inner thigh from a childhood fall, the way her back arched when she was close to losing control. And now, standing here, he felt the memories flood back, not just of her body, but of her. The way she'd laugh until she couldn't breathe, the way she'd curl into him on rainy mornings, the way she'd challenge him with a single raised eyebrow and a smirk that could unravel him. Isla's gaze didn't waver, but she didn't move toward him. Neither did he. They were two planets, caught in each other's orbit, too afraid to collide, too drawn to drift apart. He saw the moment she made a decision, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, and she turned slightly, breaking the spell. She murmured something to the woman beside her, her lips moving in that familiar way that made Dylan's chest tighten. Then she disappeared into the crowd, her auburn hair, a beacon he couldn't stop tracking. He should leave, he should walk out, get in his car, drive back to his sterile condo, and forget this ever happened, but his feet wouldn't move. His body, traitor that it was, wanted to follow her, to close the distance, to see if her skin still smelled like jasmine and citrus, if her voice still carried that faint rasp when she was nervous. He hated himself for it, but he couldn't deny the truth. Isla Martinez was still under his skin, in his blood, in the very air he breathed. The event dragged on, the author's speech a blur of words Dylan didn't hear. He sipped his wine, the glass cold against his palm, and tried to focus on anything else, the geometric pattern of the bookstore's ceiling, the way the light caught the edge of a shelf, the woman in front of him who kept glancing his way with a smile he didn't return. But his mind was a traitor too, replaying moments he'd buried deep. The first time he'd kissed Isla under a streetlight in Little Italy, her lips tasting of sangria and possibility. The nights they'd spent tangled in their old apartment, her nails digging into his back, her breath hot against his ear. The fights, toothed ones that left them both raw, shouting things they didn't mean, until the silence became louder than their voices. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice her approach until she was standing right in front of him, Isla, close enough to touch, her scent enveloping him like a wave. Up close, she was even more devastating. Her eyes were a deep, liquid brown, flecked with gold, and they held his with an intensity that made his throat go dry. Her lips, painted a soft coral, were slightly parted, and he could see the faint sheen of gloss, the way they caught the light. Her dress clung to her like a second skin, accentuating the curve of her shoulders, the gentle slope of her neck, the way her chest rose and fell with each breath. She was a masterpiece, every inch of her crafted to drive him to distraction. "Dylan," she said, her voice low, a little unsteady, like she was testing the weight of his name. It was the same voice that used to whisper his name in the dark, the one that could make him forget his own. I didn't expect to see you here." He swallowed, his throat tight, and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, well, San Diego's a small world sometimes." His voice was rougher than he intended, betraying the storm inside him. He wanted to say more, wanted to ask why she was back, what she was doing here, if she'd thought of him in the 2 years they'd been apart. But the words stuck, caught behind the wall he'd built to keep her out. She tilted her head, a gesture so familiar it hurt, and her hair shifted, revealing the delicate line of her jaw. "You look good," she said, her eyes flicking over him, taking in the sharp lines of his blazer, the way his shirt hugged his chest, the faint stubble along his jaw. Her gaze lingered on his hands, and he wondered if she was remembering the way they used to fit against her skin, the way his fingers knew every curve of her body. "You too," he said, and it was an understatement. She was radiant, magnetic, the kind of woman who made you want to drop everything and follow her anywhere. He wanted to reach out, to brush his thumb along the curve of her cheek, to see if she'd lean into his touch the way she used to. But he didn't. He couldn't. Not after everything. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Around them, the crowd buzzed, oblivious to the history unfolding in their midst. Isla shifted her weight, her hips swaying slightly, and Dylan's eyes betrayed him, following the movement. He saw the way her dress clung to her thighs, the way her calves flexed in her heels, and he forced himself to look back at her face. But her eyes were knowing, a faint spark of amusement in them, as if she'd caught him and didn't mind. "I should get back," she said finally, nodding toward the signing table. "It was nice seeing you, Dylan." "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nice seeing you, Isla." She turned to go, her hair swinging softly, and he watched her walk away, each step a reminder of what he'd lost. But as she reached the edge of the crowd, she glanced back just for a moment, and their eyes locked again. It was a look that said everything they couldn't, the longing, the pain, the memories that refused to fade. And in that moment, Dylan knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The book launch was winding down, the crowd thinning as the last signatures were scrawled and wine glasses emptied. Dylan Nguyen lingered near the bookstore's exit, his hazel eyes restless, searching the room for her, Isla Martinez, the woman who'd slipped back into his life like a half-remembered dream, stirring emotions he'd sworn were buried. His fingers, long and calloused from years of sketching blueprints, toyed with the edge of his blazer sleeve, a nervous habit he hadn't indulged in years. At 36, Dylan was a man who commanded boardrooms and construction sites with unshakable confidence, but here, in the presence of his past, he felt like a boy again, heart racing, palms faintly damp, every nerve attuned to her. He spotted her near the author's table, her auburn hair glowing under the soft lights like a halo of fire. Isla was laughing, her head tilted back, exposing the elegant curve of her throat. The sound of her laugh, low and melodic, hit Dylan like a punch, dragging him back to nights when that same laugh would fill their tiny apartment, when he'd pull her close and kiss the spot just below her ear until she melted into him. Her emerald green dress clung to her like a lover's touch, accentuating the gentle swell of her breasts, the dip of her waist, the flare of her hips. Each movement she made was a study in grace, her fingers brushing a lock of hair behind her ear, her hips swaying as she shifted her weight, her legs, long and sculpted, catching the light with every step. She was a vision, the kind of woman who could make you forget your own name, and Dylan was no exception. He was about to turn away, to force himself to leave, before he did something reckless when she looked up. Their eyes met again, just as they had earlier, and the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Isla's lips parted, a faint flush creeping up her neck, and Dylan felt his resolve crumble. She murmured something to the woman beside her, handed off her empty wine glass, and started toward him. Each step she took was deliberate, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, her dress shifting against her thighs in a way that made Dylan's mouth go dry. Up close, she was even more breathtaking. Her deep brown eyes flecked with gold, her lips glossy and inviting, her skin radiating warmth that he could almost feel from where he stood. "Dylan," she said, her voice soft but carrying that familiar rasp, the one that used to unravel him in the dark. "You're still here." He managed a half smile, his gaze flicking over her face, lingering on the curve of her cheekbones, the faint freckles dusting her nose. "Couldn't quite make myself leave," he admitted, his voice low, rough with the weight of everything he wasn't saying. He wanted to ask her 1,000 things, why she was back in San Diego, if she'd missed him, if she'd felt the same ache he had these past 2 years, but instead, he gestured toward the door. "Heading out?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her clutch, and for a moment, he thought she'd say no, but then she nodded, a small, almost shy smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah, walk with me?" The invitation was simple, but it felt like a lifeline, pulling him back to a time when walking side by side with her was as natural as breathing. He nodded, and they stepped out into the San Diego evening, the air cool and salty from the nearby ocean. The street was alive, with the hum of downtown cars gliding past, neon signs flickering, couples laughing as they spilled out of restaurants. Isla's heels clicked against the sidewalk, her stride confident but unhurried, and Dylan matched her pace, his hands shoved into his pockets to keep from reaching for her. They didn't speak at first, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that carried history, the kind that said more than words ever could. Dylan stole glances at her, unable to help himself, the way her hair swayed with each step, brushing against the bare skin of her shoulders, the way her dress hugged her curves, hinting at the body he'd once known better than his own, the soft slope of her lower back, the taut muscles of her thighs, the way her hips fit perfectly against his. Even now, dressed in the polished elegance of a book editor, she was the same Isla who'd dance barefoot in their kitchen, who'd tease him until he couldn't resist pinning her against the counter, her laughter turning to gasps under his touch. "You're quiet," she said finally, her voice cutting through his thoughts. She glanced at him, her eyes catching the streetlights, sparkling like they held a secret. "What's on your mind?" He chuckled, the sound rough, self-deprecating. "You really want to know?" He met her gaze, and for a moment, the air between them thickened, charged with the weight of their past. He wanted to tell her he was thinking about her, about the way her lips felt against his, the way her body arched under his hands, the way she'd look at him like he was the only man in the world, but he didn't. Instead, he said, "Just surprised to see you, that's all. It's been a while." Her smile was wistful, and she looked away, her fingers brushing the gold pendant at her throat. 2 years, she said softly, "feels like forever, and yesterday all at once." They turned a corner, and Dylan's heart stuttered as he realized where they were. The street was lined with familiar storefronts, and there, tucked between a boutique and a wine bar, was the Hideaway, the coffee shop, where they'd spent countless mornings, afternoons, and late nights, when they were together. Its windows glowed warmly, the scent of roasted coffee and cinnamon drifting out into the evening air. Isla slowed, her steps faltering, and Dylan knew she recognized it too. "Want to grab a coffee?" he asked, his voice casual, but his pulse was racing. He wasn't sure if he was asking because he wanted to prolong this moment or because he was desperate to see if the past could still feel real. She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the shop's sign, then back to him. "Sure," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for old time's sake." Inside, the hideaway was exactly as they remembered, cozy, dimly lit, with mismatched furniture and shelves lined with dog-eared books. The barista, a young woman with a nose ring, barely glanced up as they ordered. Dylan got a black coffee, Isla a chai latte, just like always. They found a table in the corner, the same one they used to claim, tucked against a window overlooking the street. The table was small, forcing them to sit close, their knees brushing under the surface. The contact sent a jolt through Dylan, and he saw the way Isla's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around her mug. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, trying to keep things light. "How's life been? You're back in San Diego now?" She nodded, sipping her latte, her lips leaving a faint imprint on the rim of the mug. Dylan's eyes followed the movement, his mind betraying him with memories of those lips against his skin. "Yeah," she said. "I was in Seattle for a year, working on a project. Just moved back a few weeks ago. The publishing world's intense, but I love it. Keeps me busy." "Busy's good," he said, his voice neutral, but he was studying her, searching for cracks in her polished exterior. Her hands, delicate but strong, moved with a nervous energy. Her nails painted a soft peach that contrasted with her olive skin. He noticed the absence of a ring on her left hand, and the realization hit him harder than it should have. "You look like you're thriving," he added, his gaze lingering on her face, taking in the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks, the way her lips curved when she smiled. She laughed, a soft, self-conscious sound, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Trying to," she said. "What about you? Still building those gorgeous houses?" He shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Something like that. Firm's doing well. Got a few projects up in La Jolla, one in Coronado. Keeps me out of trouble." Her eyes sparkled with amusement, and she leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table, her posture drawing his attention to the neckline of her dress, the way it framed the smooth expanse of her chest. "Dylan Nguyen? Out of trouble?" "I don't buy it," she teased, her voice dropping to a playful lilt that made his stomach tighten. "You were always trouble." He laughed, the sound genuine, and for a moment, it was like they were back in their 20s, flirting over coffee, stealing glances that promised more. "Maybe I've reformed," he said, raising an eyebrow. "You ever think about that?" Her smile faltered, just for a second, and she looked down at her mug, her fingers tracing the handle. "Maybe," she said softly, "but some things don't change." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Dylan felt the air shift, the conversation teetering on the edge of something deeper, something dangerous. He wanted to ask about her life, really ask. Had she dated? Fallen in love? Did she still wake up in the middle of the night, reaching for him the way he sometimes did for her, but he didn't? Instead, he steered the conversation to safer ground, asking about her work, her travels, the books she'd edited. She answered easily, her voice animated, her hands gesturing in that expressive way he'd always loved. But there was a carefulness to her words, a deliberate avoidance of anything too personal, and he matched her, keeping his own stories surface level, steering clear of the void where their marriage used to be. They talked for an hour, maybe more, the coffee shop emptying around them. The barista started wiping down counters, a subtle hint, but neither of them moved to leave. Dylan watched Isla as she spoke, captivated by the way her lips moved, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about a book she loved. Her beauty was effortless, but it was more than that. It was the way she carried herself, the way she made you feel like you were the only person in the room. Her dress had ridden up slightly, revealing a sliver of thigh, and Dylan's eyes betrayed him, lingering on the smooth-toned skin. He imagined tracing his fingers along it, feeling the warmth of her, the way her muscles would tense under his touch. He forced his gaze back to her face, but her eyes were on him, and the faint curve of her lips told him she'd noticed. "Still got that stare," she said, her voice teasing but laced with something heavier. "You always looked at me like you were trying to memorize me." "Maybe I was," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. His voice was low, rough, and he saw the way her breath caught, the way her fingers stilled on her mug. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the air between them thick with tension, with memories, with the unspoken question of what they were doing here, sitting in their old haunt, pretending they were strangers. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, closing the small distance between them. "You ever go back?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "To the old place?" Isla's eyes darkened, and she looked away, her fingers brushing the pendant at her throat again. "No," she said, her voice soft, almost fragile. "I couldn't. I was afraid. I wouldn't be able to leave." The words hit Dylan like a wave, pulling him under. He saw the truth in her eyes, the same fear he'd felt every time he passed their old apartment, the one he'd kept as a studio, unable to let it go. It was a shrine to their past, every corner holding a memory of her of them. He wanted to reach for her, to pull her across the table and kiss her until the last 2 years disappeared, but he didn't. He couldn't. Not yet. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows, and the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the window. Isla glanced outside, her expression unreadable, and Dylan felt the moment slipping away. "We should probably go," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "Yeah," he agreed, but neither of them moved. They sat there, caught in the gravity of each other, the past and present colliding in a way that felt both inevitable and terrifying. And as the rain began to fall harder, Dylan knew this wasn't the end of their story. Not tonight, maybe not ever. The rain came down in sheets, a sudden San Diego downpour that turned the streets into rivers of reflected neon. Dylan, Nguyen, and Isla Martinez stood under the awning of the hideaway, the coffee shop's warm glow fading behind them as the city shimmered in the wet night. Isla's auburn hair was damp at the ends, clinging to her bare shoulders, and her emerald green dress, now speckled with rain, hugged her curves even more tightly, outlining the lithe shape of her body. At 34, she was a vision of effortless allure, her deep brown eyes catching the streetlights, her lips slightly parted, her olive skin glistening with the faintest sheen of moisture. The way she stood, one hip cocked, her weight on one leg, made Dylan's pulse quicken. Her legs, long and toned, seemed to beckon his gaze, the hem of her dress riding up just enough to reveal the smooth expanse of her thighs. She was a masterpiece, every inch of her crafted to drive him to distraction, and he was helpless against it. Dylan, at 36, was no less striking. The rain had slicked his dark hair, making it fall in soft, reckless waves over his forehead, accentuating the sharp angles of his jaw. His navy blazer was damp, clinging to the broad planes of his shoulders, the white shirt beneath hinting at the lean muscles of his chest and arms. His hazel eyes, flecked with gold, were fixed on Isla, dark with a hunger he couldn't hide. He stood close, too close, his 6-foot frame towering over her, his hands shoved into his pockets to keep from reaching out. The air between them crackled, heavy with the weight of their history, the coffee shop conversation still lingering like a half-spoken promise. "We should get you out of this rain," Dylan said, his voice low, rough with an edge he couldn't mask. He gestured toward the street, where his car was parked a block away. "I'll drive you home." Isla hesitated, her eyes searching his face, and for a moment, he thought she'd refuse. But then she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and tucked a damp strand of hair behind her ear. "Okay," she said, her voice soft, the faintest tremor betraying her nerves. "Thanks, Dylan." They ran through the rain, Isla's heels splashing in shallow puddles, her laughter a bright, unguarded sound cutting through the storm. Dylan kept pace, his hand hovering near her elbow, not quite touching but ready to steady her if she slipped. The rain soaked them both, his shirt clinging to his skin, outlining the taut lines of his torso, the way his muscles flexed with each step. Isla's dress was a second skin now, the fabric translucent in places, revealing the curve of her waist, the gentle swell of her breasts, the delicate line of her collarbone. Dylan tried not to look, but his eyes betrayed him, drinking her in, memorizing every detail, as if she might vanish again. They reached his Cara sleek black Audi, parked under a flickering streetlight, and Dylan opened the passenger door for her, his fingers brushing hers as she slid inside. The contact was electric, a spark that made his breath catch, and he saw the way her lips parted, her eyes flicking to his hand before she looked away. He closed the door and circled to the driver's side, the rain cooling his skin, but doing nothing to quell the heat building inside him. Inside the car, the air was warm, intimate, filled with the scent of her jasmine and citrus, mixed with the faint musk of rain-soaked skin. Isla sat with her hands in her lap, her fingers twisting together, her thighs pressed close in the confines of the seat. Dylan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening, and forced himself to focus on the road. "Where to?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. She gave him an address in North Park, her new place, but as he pulled onto the street, he realized the route would take them past their old apartment in Hillcrest, the one they'd shared for 3 years, the one he'd kept as a studio after she left. The thought of it made his throat tighten, and he glanced at her, wondering if she'd noticed. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window, but her fingers were still, her breathing shallow, as if she were bracing herself. They drove in silence, the only sounds, the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the soft patter of rain. The city blurred past neon signs, palm trees, the occasional flash of headlights, but inside the car, it was just them, the space between them charged with memories. Dylan's mind wandered, unbidden, to the nights they'd driven these same streets, Isla's hand on his thigh, her laughter filling the car, her body leaning into his at stoplights. He remembered the way she'd look at him, her eyes half-lidded, her lips curved in a smile that promised trouble. Now, she was inches away, her presence, a tangible weight, and he wanted nothing more than to pull over, to close the distance, to see if her skin still felt like home. As they approached Hillcrest, the streetlights illuminated the familiar brick building. On the corner their old apartment. Dylan's grip on the wheel tightened, and he felt Isla shift beside him, her head turning to look out the window. "That's," she started, her voice trailing off, barely audible over the rain. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "Still got it. Use it as a studio now." She turned to him, her eyes wide, searching. "You kept it?" He nodded, not trusting himself to say more. The truth was, he hadn't been able to let it go, not the apartment, not the memories, not her. It was a piece of them, frozen in time, every corner holding a fragment of their life together. He saw the question in her eyes, the one she didn't ask, and he answered it anyway. "Couldn't sell it," he said quietly. "Didn't want to." Isla's lips parted, but she didn't speak. The rain pounded harder, the car idling at a stoplight, and the moment stretched, heavy with possibility. Then, almost without thinking, Dylan said, "Want to see it?" Her breath caught, audible in the quiet, and she looked at him, her eyes dark, unreadable. He thought she'd say no, that she'd draw the line here, but then she nodded, a small, almost reckless gesture. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling with something he couldn't name. He turned the car down the familiar street, parking in the small lot behind the building. The rain hadn't let up, and they ran again, laughing despite themselves, Isla's hand brushing his as they ducked under the overhang at the entrance. Dylan fumbled with his keys, his heart pounding, and pushed open the door to the lobby, the scent of old wood and faint paint greeting them. The elevator was out of service as always, and they climbed the stairs to the third floor, their footsteps echoing in the quiet. Isla was close behind him, her breath warm against his neck as they reached the door, and he felt her presence like a physical touch, urging him forward. Inside, the apartment was a time capsule. The hardwood floors gleamed under the soft glow of a single lamp Dylan had left on, the exposed brick walls lined with his sketches and blueprints. The furniture was sparsely leather sofa, a drafting table, a bookshelf crammed with art books and old novels, but the space felt alive, humming with memories. The kitchenette in the corner still had the same countertop where Isla used to perch, her legs dangling, teasing him as he cooked. The window nook where they'd spent lazy Sundays, tangled in each other, the city sprawling below. And the dining table, sturdy oak piece they'd bought at a flea market, stood in the center, its surface worn from years of shared meals, spilled wine, and moments when they'd loved each other right there. Too impatient to make it to the bedroom, Isla stepped inside, her heels clicking softly, and stopped, her eyes sweeping the room. Dylan watched her, his chest tight, as she took it all in. Her dress was still damp, clinging to her like a lover, outlining every curved, gentle slope of her shoulders, the taut line of her stomach, the way her hips swayed as she moved. Her hair, now a wild cascade of wet waves, framed her face, and her skin glowed in the dim light, her cheeks flushed from the run through the rain. She was breathtaking, a vision of strength and vulnerability, and Dylan felt the pull of her, the need to close the distance, to touch her and see if she was real. She walked to the dining table, her fingers trailing along its edge, lingering on a faint scratch they'd made one night, too caught up in each other to care. "It's exactly the same," she said, her voice soft, almost reverent, like we never left. Dylan stepped closer, unable to stay away, his shoes scuffing against the floor. "Some things don't change," he said, echoing her words from the coffee shop, but his voice was rougher now, laced with a hunger he couldn't hide. He stopped a foot away, close enough to feel the heat of her body, to see the way her chest rose and fell with each breath. Her scent enveloped him, jasmine, citrus, rain, and he was drowning in it, in her. Isla turned to face him, her eyes locking onto his, and the air between them thickened, charged with 1,000 unspoken words. Her lips were parted, glossy and inviting, and he could see the pulse at her throat, racing under her skin. Her hands were still resting on the table, but her fingers twitched, as if she were fighting the same urge he was. "Dylan," she said, her voice barely a whisper, and the sound of his name on her lips was a spark, igniting something primal inside him. He didn't think. He didn't speak. He just moved, closing the distance, his hand reaching for hers. His fingers wrapped around her wrist, gentle but firm, and he felt the warmth of her skin, the faint tremor running through her. She didn't pull away. She didn't move. She just looked at him, her eyes wide, her breath shallow, and the world narrowed to the space between them, to the heat of her skin against his, to the way her body seemed to lean into his touch. "Isla," he said, his voice raw, and it was a plea, a question, a confession all at once. He stepped closer, his other hand hovering near her waist, not quite touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her. Her dress was taut across her hips, the fabric outlining the curve he'd once traced with his lips, and he wanted nothing more than to pull her against him, to feel her body pressed to his, to lose himself in her the way he used to. She tilted her head, her hair falling over one shoulder, exposing the delicate line of her neck, the freckle just below her ear that he'd kissed 1,000 times. "We shouldn't be here," she said, but her voice was unsteady, her eyes betraying her words. She didn't move away. She didn't break his hold. And when her free hand lifted, her fingers brushing the damp fabric of his shirt, tracing the line of his chest, Dylan's control snapped. He let go of her wrist and stepped into her, his hands finding her waist, pulling her close. She gasped, a soft, desperate sound, and her body molded to his, her curves fitting against the hard planes of his frame as if they'd never been apart. His fingers splayed across her lower back, feeling the warmth of her skin through the thin, wet fabric of her dress, the way her muscles tensed under his touch. Her hands slid up his chest, her nails grazing his skin through his shirt, and she tilted her head back, her lips inches from his, her breath hot against his mouth. The silence was deafening, stretching into eternity, every second a battle between restraint and surrender. Dylan's eyes searched hers, looking for a reason to stop, but all he saw was her beauty, her strength, the woman he'd loved and lost and never stopped wanting. His thumb brushed the curve of her hip, slow, deliberate, and she shivered, her lips parting further, her body arching into his. And then he was done fighting. His hands slid up her back, one tangling in her hair, the other pressing her closer, and he pulled her into him, his body enveloping hers. The embrace was fierce, almost desperate, a collision of need and memory and unspoken apologies. Isla's arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers digging into his shoulders, and she pressed herself against him, her curves soft and yielding, her breath hitching as she buried her face in his chest. He felt her tremble, heard the soft, choked sound she made, and it broke something inside him. He held her tighter, his lips brushing the top of her head, her hair silky against his skin. "Isla," he whispered, his voice raw, and it was all he could say, all he could feel. She was here, in his arms, in their old apartment, and for the first time in 2 years, he felt whole. The rain pounded against the windows, the city a distant hum, and they stood there, locked in each other's arms, the past and present blurring into one. The apartment held its breath, its walls bearing witness to their reunion, to the memories that refused to fade. And as Dylan held her, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his, he knew this was only the beginning of what he wasn't sure, but he wasn't ready to let her go. Not tonight, maybe not ever. The rain battered the windows of the Hillcrest apartment, a relentless drumbeat that mirrored the pounding of Dylan Nguyen's heart. He held Isla Martinez in his arms, their bodies pressed so close that he could feel the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the heat of her skin seeping through the damp fabric of her emerald green dress. At 36, Dylan was a man of control. His architecture firm demanded it. His life after their divorce required it. But here, with Isla, that control was a fraying thread. His hands, broad and calloused from years of sketching and building, gripped her waist, his fingers digging into the soft curves of her hips, as if anchoring himself to her. His dark hair, still wet from the rain, fell in reckless waves over his forehead, framing hazel eyes that burned with a hunger he couldn't hide. His white shirt, now nearly transparent, clung to the lean muscles of his chest and arms, outlining the strength that had always made Isla feel safe, desired, alive. Isla, at 34, was a vision of raw, untamed beauty. Her auburn hair, a cascade of wet waves, spilled over her shoulders, framing a face that was both fierce and vulnerable. High cheekbones flushed with heat, lips parted and glossy, deep brown eyes flecked with gold that held his gaze with an intensity that stole his breath. Her dress, soaked from the storm, was a second skin, molding to every curve the gentle swell of her breasts, the taut line of her stomach, the flare of her hips that swayed with every breath. Her olive skin glistened, catching the dim light of the apartment, and her legs, long and sculpted, seemed to beckon him closer. The hem of her dress riding up to reveal thighs he'd once worshipped with his hands, his lips, his everything. She was a siren, her presence a pull he couldn't resist, and the way she pressed herself against him, her hands clutching his shoulders, told him she was just as lost in this moment as he was. The apartment, their old home, now Dylan's studio, was a cocoon of memories, its oak table and exposed brick walls silent witnesses to the storm unfolding within. The air was thick with the scent of rain, jasmine, and the faint musk of their shared heat. Dylan's hands slid up Isla's back, one tangling in her hair, the other pressing her closer, and she arched into him, a soft gasp escaping her lips. The sound was a spark, igniting something primal, something that had been buried but never extinguished. 2 years of distance, of divorce papers and sleepless nights, dissolved in the space between their bodies, leaving only Nidra, unfiltered and undeniable. "Dylan," Isla whispered, her voice a tremulous plea, and the sound of his name on her lips was his undoing. He didn't speak. Words were too fragile for this moment, too small to hold the weight of what they were feeling. Instead, he moved, his lips crashing into hers with a desperation that bordered on violence. The kiss was fire, a collision of need and memory, their mouths moving with a hunger that spoke of all the nights they'd spent apart, all the times they'd tried to forget. Her lips were soft, warm, tasting of chai and rain, and they yielded to his, parting to let him in. her tongue meeting his in a dance that was both familiar and electric. His hands tightened in her hair, tilting her head to deepen the kiss, and she moaned a low, throaty sound that vibrated through him, setting every nerve alight. Isla's hands were everywhere, frantic, greedy. Her fingers raked down his chest, nails scraping through the wet fabric of his shirt, tracing the hard lines of his pecs, the ridges of his abs. She tugged at the buttons, impatient, and when the shirt fell open, she pressed her palms to his skin, her touch searing, possessive. His body was a map. She knew by heart the faint scar on his ribcage from a teenage skateboarding accident, the way his muscles flexed under her fingers, the heat radiating from him like a furnace. She broke the kiss, her lips trailing along his jaw, down the column of his throat, and Dylan groaned, his head tipping back, his hands gripping her hips to keep from losing himself entirely. "Isla," he rasped, his voice rough, reverent, and she answered by pressing herself closer, her body molding to his, her curves soft against his hardness. Her dress was a barrier he couldn't stand, and his hands slid to her thighs, bunching the fabric, pulling it higher until he could feel the smooth, warm skin beneath. Her thighs were firm, silken, and he traced them with his fingers, slow, deliberate, memorizing the way they trembled under his touch. She gasped, her head falling against his shoulder, her breath hot against his neck, and he felt the way her body responded, the way she arched into him, silently begging for more. He lifted her, effortless, and she wrapped her legs around his waist, her dress riding up to her hips, revealing the black lace of her underwear, the curve of her ass that fit perfectly in his hands. He carried her to the oak table, the one they'd bought together, and set her down, her thighs parting to pull him closer. The table creaked under her weight, a familiar sound that dragged them back to nights when they'd been too impatient to make it to the bedroom, when this table had been their altar, their sanctuary. Isla's hands found his belt, her fingers deft, despite the tremor running through them, and she tugged it free, the leather snapping against his hips. His jeans followed, pooling at his ankles, and she ran her hands over him, her touch bold, claiming, as if she were reminding herself that he was real, that this was happening. Dylan's hands were just as urgent, sliding under her dress, pushing it higher until it bunched around her waist. His fingers traced the edge of her underwear, teasing, and she whimpered, her hips bucking against his hand, her eyes locked on his with a plea that needed no words. He leaned in, his lips brushing hers, soft this time, almost tender, and whispered, "I've missed you." The words were raw, stripped bare, and they broke something in her, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she pulled him closer, her lips crashing into his with a need that matched his own. They moved together, a rhythm as old as their love, their bodies remembering what their minds had tried to forget. His hands roamed her, worshiping every inch the curve of her breasts, the dip of her waist, the way her thighs clenched around him. Her skin was silk under his fingers, warm and alive, and he kissed her everywhere, her lips, her throat, the freckle below her ear, the hollow of her collarbone. She was a canvas, and he was painting her with his touch, his lips, his breath, reclaiming what had always been his. Isla's hands were in his hair, tugging, guiding, her nails digging into his scalp as she arched against him, her moans filling the apartment, drowning out the rain. When he finally entered her, it was like coming home. The world narrowed to the heat of her, the way she enveloped him, the way her body welcomed him, with a shudder that rippled through them both. She gasped his name, her voice breaking, and he moved with her, slow at first, savoring every sensation, the tightness, the warmth, the way her hips rose to meet his. Her legs tightened around him, her heels digging into his back, urging him deeper, faster, and he gave in, his controls shattering as they chased the edge together. The table rocked beneath them, the wood groaning, and the apartment seemed to pulse with their rhythm, its walls holding the echoes of their love, their pain, their everything. Dylan's lips found her ear, his breath hot and ragged. "I remember you," he whispered, his voice a low growl. "Every inch of you. Even when I hated you, I remembered." The words were confession, a wound laid bare, and Isla's response was a sob, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body trembling as she clung to him. "I hated myself," she whispered back, her voice thick with tears, "because I still wanted you like this." The admission broke them both, and they moved with a desperation that bordered on sacred, their bodies speaking what their hearts couldn't. The rain outside was a distant roar, the city a forgotten dream, and all that existed was this, their heat, their breath, their love that had never truly died. When they reached the peak, it was a collision of stars, a release that left them gasping, clinging to each other as the world spun and settled. Isla's head fell against his chest, her breath uneven, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on his skin. Dylan held her, his arms strong, protective, his lips brushing her forehead as they came down from the high, their bodies still entwined, their hearts still racing. They stayed like that for a long time. The table, their anchor, the apartment, their witness. The rain slowed to a drizzle, the city humming faintly beyond the walls, but neither of them moved to break the spell. Dylan's hands roamed her back, soothing now, memorizing the feel of her, and Isla's fingers lingered on his chest, her touch soft, almost reverent. There were no words, only the quiet language of their bodies, the unspoken truth that they'd never stopped belonging to each other. Finally, Isla lifted her head, her eyes meeting his, and there was something new in them, a mix of peace and turmoil, love and fear. She smiled, a small, fragile thing, and leaned in to kiss him, soft and slow, a kiss that held all the tenderness they'd forgotten how to give. "This doesn't fix us," she whispered against his lips, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "But God, I needed it." Dylan nodded, his throat tight, and kissed her again, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears that fell. "Neither did I," he said, his voice raw, "but I needed you." They disentangled slowly, reluctantly, their bodies still humming with the afterglow. Isla slid off the table, her dress falling back into place, though it was rumpled now, marked by their passion. Dylan pulled his jeans back on, his shirt hanging open, his chest still heaving. They stood there, a foot apart, the distance feeling both vast and insignificant. The apartment was quiet now, the rain, a soft patter, and the weight of what they'd done settled over them, not regret, but a question, a challenge, a possibility. Isla reached for him, her fingers brushing his wrist, and he caught her hand, pulling her into one last embrace. They held each other, not as lovers or exes, but as two people who'd found each other again, if only for a moment. And as the rain fell outside, washing the city clean, they stood in the heart of their past, wondering if it could ever be their future. The first rays of dawn crept through the rain-streaked windows of the Hillcrest apartment, casting a soft, golden glow over the hardwood floors. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet city, and a sky streaked with pink and lavender. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the scent of rain, coffee, and the lingering musk of last night's passion. Nguyen and Isla Martinez lay tangled in a makeshift bed of blankets on the leather sofa, their bodies pressed close, skin still humming from the intensity of their reunion. The apartment, their old home, now Dylan's studio, felt like a bubble, a fragile sanctuary where the world couldn't touch them, at least for now. Dylan woke first, his hazel eyes blinking open to the sight of Isla nestled against him. At 36, he was a man who wore his strength like armor, his broad shoulders and lean muscles a testament to years of discipline. But in this moment, he was soft, vulnerable, his guard lowered by the woman in his arms. His dark hair, mussed from sleep and her fingers, fell in soft waves over his forehead, framing a face that was both rugged and refined, sharp jawline, faint stubble, eyes that held a depth of longing he couldn't hide. His bare chest rose and fell with slow, steady breaths, the faint scars and contours of his body catching the morning light. He was beautiful, the kind of man who could command a room, but chose to give himself entirely to her, his hands resting possessively on her waist, as if afraid she might slip away. Isla, at 34, was a vision of quiet radiance. Her auburn hair spilled across the blanket, a wild cascade of waves that glowed like burnished copper in the dawn. Her olive skin was flushed, warm, and her deep brown eyes, still closed in sleep, were framed by lashes that brushed her cheeks. She wore one of Dylan's old t-shirts, the fabric slipping off one shoulder to reveal the delicate curve of her collarbone, the freckle just below her ear that he'd kissed countless times. The shirt rode up, exposing the smooth expanse of her thighs, the gentle curve of her hips, and the way her legs curled against his, their skin pressed together in a way that felt both intimate and eternal. She was a goddess, her beauty both fierce and tender, and even in sleep, she exuded a magnetism that made Dylan's chest ache with want, with love, with fear. He watched her, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her lower back, memorizing the feel of the silk of her skin, the warmth that radiated from her, the way her body fit against his like it was made to. Last night had been a wildfire, a collision of need and memory that had left them both breathless. But this morning was different, quieter, heavier, a moment to confront what they'd done, what it meant, what came next. He didn't regret it, not for a second, but the absence of guilt surprised him. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, a fullness, a paradox that made his heart race and his throat tighten. He loved her. He'd never stopped, but love hadn't been enough before, and the question of whether it could be now hung over them like a shadow. Isla stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and when she saw him, a small, sleepy smile curved her lips. "Morning," she murmured, her voice husky, laced with the rasp that always drove him wild. She stretched, her body arching against his, the t-shirt lifting to reveal more of her stomach, the taut lines of her muscles, the curve of her waist that begged for his touch. Her legs shifted, brushing against his, and the contact sent a jolt through him, a reminder of how easily she could unravel him. "Morning," he replied, his voice low, rough with sleep and something deeper. He leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead, his lips lingering on her skin, breathing in her scent, jasmine, citrus, and the faint salt of their shared night. She sighed, her hand sliding up his chest, her fingers tracing the lines of his collarbone, the pulse at his throat. Her touch was gentle, exploratory, as if she were rediscovering him, and he felt his body respond, his muscles tensing, his breath hitching. They lay there for a while, silent, their bodies speaking in touches and glances. The apartment was quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of the city waking up and the soft creak of the sofa as they shifted. Dylan's hand moved to her hair, his fingers threading through the silky strands, and Isla's eyes met his, dark and searching, holding a question neither of them was ready to voice. What now? The weight of it pressed against them, but for now, they let it linger, choosing the comfort of each other's presence over the uncertainty of words. Eventually, Isla sat up, the t-shirt slipping further, revealing the curve of her shoulder, the edge of her breast, and Dylan's eyes followed, greedy for every inch of her. She caught his gaze and smiled, a knowing, almost playful curve of her lips that made his stomach tighten. "You're staring," she said, her voice teasing, but there was warmth in it, an invitation. "Can't help it," he said, his voice a low growl. And he sat up too, his hand finding her thigh, his fingers tracing the smooth skin, slow, deliberate. She shivered, her breath catching, and for a moment, he thought they might fall back into each other, let the morning dissolve into another wave of passion. But she gently placed her hand over his, stopping him, her touch firm but kind. "We should eat," she said, her voice soft, practical, but her eyes betrayed the conflict inside her. "I'm starving." He nodded, reluctant to let go, but he stood, pulling her up with him. She was close, her body inches from his, and he could feel the heat radiating from her, the pull of her presence like gravity. He wanted to kiss her, to pull her back to the sofa, to lose himself in her again, but he saw the resolve in her eyes, the need to ground this moment in something ordinary, something safe. So he led her to the kitchenette, the same one where they'd cooked countless meals, where she'd perch on the counter and steal bites of his cooking, where they'd laughed and fought and loved with equal ferocity. Dylan rummaged through the sparse pantry, finding eggs, butter, a loaf of bread enough for the breakfast they used to share every Sunday. Isla leaned against the counter, watching him, her arms crossed, the t-shirt riding up to reveal the curve of her hip, the long lines of her legs. She was a vision, casual and unguarded, and he felt a pang of nostalgia so sharp it hurt. This was how it used to be, mornings filled with quiet intimacy, her presence filling the space, making it home. He cracked the eggs into a bowl, his movements practiced, and she smiled, a small, wistful thing. "Eggs sunny side up," she said, her voice soft, just like old times. "Some things don't change," he said, echoing their earlier words, and their eyes met, a shared understanding passing between them. He heated the pan, the sizzle of butter filling the air, and Isla moved closer, her shoulder brushing his as she reached for the coffee maker. The contact was electric, a reminder of how close they were, how easy it would be to cross the line again. She filled the machine, her fingers deft, her hair falling over one shoulder, and he watched her, captivated by the way she moved, the way her body seemed to hum with life. They worked in tandem, a rhythm born of years together, and soon the apartment was filled with the scent of coffee and frying eggs. Isla toasted the bread, her movements graceful, her hips swaying slightly as she hummed a tune he didn't recognize. He wanted to pull her close, to dance with her the way they used to, her body pressed to his, her laughter in his ear, but he held back, sensing the fragility of this moment. They set the table, the same oak table where they'd loved each other last night, and sat across from each other, their plates simple but familiar, a bridge to the past. They ate in companionable silence at first, the clink of forks and the soft sip of coffee the only sounds. Isla's hair fell in her face, and she tucked it behind her ear, her fingers lingering on the gold pendant at her throat, the one she'd worn even during their marriage. Dylan watched her, his eyes tracing the curve of her jaw, the way her lips closed around the edge of her mug, the faint flush on her cheeks. She was beautiful, not just in her features, but in the way she existed, confident, vulnerable, a woman who'd break him with a single look. He wanted to tell her he loved her, that he'd never stopped, but the words felt too big, too dangerous, so he let them sit, heavy in his chest. "This feels," Isla started, her voice soft, hesitant. She set her fork down, her eyes meeting his, and there was a storm in them, a mix of longing and uncertainty. "It feels like before, but it's not, is it?" Dylan's throat tightened, and he leaned back, his hands resting on the table, his fingers twitching with the urge to reach for her. "No," he said, his voice low, steady. "It's not, but it's something, Isla. It's us." She looked away, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug, and he saw the conflict in her posture, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her lips pressed together. "Us," she repeated, the word heavy, layered with meaning. "Us was beautiful, Dylan, but it broke us too." The truth of her words stung, a reminder of the fights, the silences, the divorce papers that had torn them apart. But last night had been a revelation, a reminder of what they could be, and he wasn't ready to let that go. "What if we could be different?" he asked, his voice raw, urgent. "What if we tried again?" Isla's eyes snapped to his, wide, searching, and for a moment he thought she might say yes, might lean across the table and kiss him, might choose them over the fear. But she didn't. She stood, her movements slow, deliberate, and walked to the window, her back to him, the t-shirt slipping to reveal the curve of her shoulder blade, the line of her spine. She was a silhouette against the dawn, a woman caught between past and present, and Dylan felt the distance between them grow, even as his heart screamed to close it. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if we can, Dylan. I don't know if I'm strong enough to try." He stood, crossing the room in 3 strides, and stopped behind her, close enough to feel the heat of her body, to see the way her hair caught the light. He didn't touch her, though every part of him ached to. "You're the strongest person I know," he said, his voice low, fervent. "And I'm not asking for promises. I'm just asking for a chance." She turned, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and for a moment, they just looked at each other, the air between them thick with everything they couldn't say. Her lips parted, and he thought she might speak, might give him an answer, but instead, she stepped into him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her face pressing to his chest. He held her, his hands sliding up her back, his lips brushing her hair, and they stood there, wrapped in each other, the city waking up around them. They stayed like that until the sun was fully up, the apartment bathed in light, and then Isla pulled away, her movements reluctant but resolute. "I need to go," she said, her voice steady now, though her eyes betrayed her. "I need time." Dylan nodded, his throat tight, and helped her gather her thingshire dress, now dry but rumpled, her heels, her clutch. She changed in the bathroom, emerging in the emerald green dress that had driven him wild, her hair pulled into a loose bun, her face bare but radiant. She was beautiful, achingly so, and he wanted to beg her to stay, to choose him, to choose them, but he didn't. He walked her to the door, his hand lingering on her arm, his eyes memorizing her face. "I'll call you," she said, but it was a promise neither of them fully believed. She leaned up, pressing a soft kiss to his cheek, her lips warm against his skin. And then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a quiet click. Dylan stood there, alone in the apartment, the scent of her still lingering, the echo of her presence filling the space. He looked at the table, the sofa, the places where they loved and fought and existed, and he felt the weight of her absence, the uncertainty of what came next. But there was hope, too, a fragile, stubborn thing that refused to die. And as the city hummed outside, he sat at the table, his coffee cold, and waited for the moment when she might come back. The San Diego sun hung high in the sky, its golden light spilling over the city, glinting off the glass towers of downtown and the waves lapping at the shores of Coronado. Inside Dylan Nguyen's Hillcrest apartment, the air was still heavy with the ghosts of the night before and the morning that had followed. The oak table bore faint marks from their passion. The leather sofa held the imprint of their bodies, and the kitchenette smelled faintly of coffee and eggs, a reminder of the breakfast they'd shared in a fragile bubble of intimacy. Dylan stood by the window, his 6-foot frame silhouetted against the light, his dark hair falling in soft, unruly waves over his forehead. At 36, he was a man of quiet strength, his broad shoulders and lean muscles outlined by a simple black t-shirt that clung to his chest, his hazel eyes fixed on the street below, searching for a sign of her. His hands, calloused from years of sketching blueprints, gripped the window frame, his knuckles whitening as he wrestled with the ache in his chest. Isla Martinez had left hours ago, her departure a quiet wound that hadn't yet begun to heal. Her presence lingered in the apartment like a perfume miasmin, citrus, and the faint musk of their shared night. Dylan could still see her in his mind's eye, as vivid as if she were standing before him. At 34, Isla was a vision of untamed beauty, her auburn hair a cascade of waves that caught the light like fire, her olive skin glowing with a warmth that begged to be touched. Her deep brown eyes, flecked with gold, had held him captive, their intensity a storm of longing and fear. The emerald green dress she'd worn last night had hugged her curves, the gentle swell of her breasts, the dip of her waist, the flare of her hips accentuating a body that was both strong and soft, a masterpiece he'd once known better than his own. Even in his t-shirt this morning, her legs long and toned, her shoulders bare, she'd been breathtaking, a woman who could unravel him with a glance, a touch, a whispered word. He turned from the window, his eyes falling on the sofa where they'd slept, tangled in each other, their bodies pressed close, as if afraid the dawn would steal them away. The blankets were still there, rumpled, and beside them, on the floor, was a piece of hair-silky black nightgown, forgotten in the rush of her departure. Dylan crouched, picking it up, his fingers tracing the delicate fabric, soft and cool against his skin. It smelled of her, and the scent hit him like a wave, dragging him back to the moment she'd slipped it on, her body half hidden in the dim light, her eyes meeting his with a mix of tenderness and turmoil. He held it to his chest, closing his eyes, and let the memory of her flood him the way her lips had felt against his, the way her thighs had wrapped around him, the way her voice had broken when she'd whispered, I hated myself because I still wanted you like this. The night had been a revelation, a collision of past and present that had stripped them bare, leaving no room for pretense. They'd loved each other with a ferocity that defied their divorce, their pain, their 2 years apart. And the morning, with its quiet breakfast and unspoken questions, had been a fragile, tentative step towards something new, or perhaps a farewell to what could never be again. Isla's words echoed in his mind. This feels like before, but it's not, is it? And his own desperate and raw, what if we could be different? What if we tried again? She hadn't answered, not really, and her silence was a weight he carried now, a question without an end. Dylan set the nightgown on the table, his movements slow, deliberate, as if preserving a relic. He sat, his hands resting on the wood, his fingers tracing the scratches they'd made in moments of reckless love. The apartment was a shrine to their past, every corner holding a memory: the kitchen counter where she'd perch, teasing him as he cooked, the window nook where they'd read together, her legs draped over his, the walls that had heard their laughter, their fights, their whispered promises. He'd kept it, not just as a studio, but as a tether to her, to them. And now it felt both sacred and suffocating, a space where he could neither move forward nor let go. The days that followed were a blur of routine meetings at his architecture firm, site visits in La Jolla, sketches that filled his nights but not his heart. He didn't call her, though his phone burned in his pocket. Her number a temptation he fought every hour. She'd said she'd call, but the silence stretched, a chasm he didn't know how to cross. He wondered where she was back in her North Park apartment, editing manuscripts, laughing with friends, living a life that no longer included him. He wondered if she thought of him, if she woke in the night, reaching for him, the way he did for her, if she regretted their night together, or craved it the way he did. The uncertainty was a blade, sharp and relentless, but there was hope, too, a stubborn spark that refused to die. 3 weeks later, a package arrived at his office, a small, nondescript box with his name scrawled in her familiar handwriting. Dylan's heart stopped, his fingers trembling as he opened it, the bustle of the office fading to nothing. Inside was a manuscript, bound in simple black, the title embossed in gold, The House We Built. And on the first page, in Isla's elegant script, was a dedication to the man who was once my home. If you ever want to come back, the door is still ajar. He read it in one sitting, alone in his condo that night, the city sprawling below his floor-to-ceiling windows. The story was theirs, thinly veiled a love that burned bright, broke apart, and lingered in the spaces between. The characters, a man and a woman, met again after years, their reunion a night of passion and pain, their mourning a question mark. The ending was open, like their own, the man holding a letter, the woman walking away, the possibility of more hanging in the air. Dylan's throat tightened as he closed the manuscript, his fingers lingering on her words, her invitation. The door is still ajar. It was a challenge, a promise, a plea, and it set his heart racing with a mix of fear and longing. He stood, pacing his condo, the manuscript clutched in his hands. Isla was out there, living, breathing, writing their story, and she left him this, a piece of her heart, a chance to choose. He could call her, drive to her apartment, knock on her door, and see if that ajar door would open wide. Or he could let her go, let the manuscript be their closure, let their night be a memory instead of a beginning. The choice was his, but it wasn't simple. Not when every part of him ached for her laugh, her touch, the way her eyes saw through him to the man he wanted to be. Dylan walked to his balcony, the night air cool against his skin, the city alive with lights and possibilities. He leaned against the railing, the manuscript still in his hand, and looked out at San Diego, the place where they'd loved and lost and found each other again. Somewhere out there, Isla was living her life, maybe waiting, maybe not. The nightgown was still in his apartment, the manuscript now, a weight in his hands, and her words echoed in his mind, a siren's call he couldn't ignore. If you ever want to come back. He didn't know what he'd donut yet, but as the stars blinked above, he felt the pull of her, the gravity of their story, and he knew this wasn't the end. Their love, broken and beautiful, was a house they'd built together, and whether they'd rebuild or let it stand as ruins was a question only time could answer. For now, he held her manuscript, her nightgown, her memory, and waited for the moment when the door might open again. And you, dear reader, are left here too, wondering what comes next. Will Dylan knock on that ajar door? Will Isla welcome him? Or has she moved on? The answers lie ahead in the next chapter of their story, waiting to unfold on our channel. Stay tuned, because Dylan and Isla's tale is far from over, and the heart of their love is just beginning to beat again.